Between January 14th and January 16th, 2026, silver breached $93 per ounce. That is a 25% surge in 14 days. JP Morgan, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo held emergency earnings calls. Their stock prices collapsed 4 to 5% in a single morning session. Most people believe this is inflation, a commodity rallying because the dollar is losing value. You see, that is the narrative designed to keep you calm. The contrarian reality is this: what you're watching is not a price rally. It is a liquidity evacuation. A regulatory trapdoor opened on January 1st, 2026, and the banks holding paper silver positions are now bleeding capital they do not have. The math is no longer sustainable. Today, I'm breaking down the three-stage mechanism that triggered the silver glitch. Stage 1, the China supply weaponization. Stage 2, the Basel III capital trap that broke a major US bullion bank. And Stage 3, the historical parallel that shows why this is not a rally, it is a reversion. We are currently in Stage 1, a mandatory protocol before we open the file. This is not financial advice. I'm not a licensed advisor. The math follows a script, but your capital is your responsibility. Always conduct your own research. On January 1st, 2026, the Ministry of Commerce of the People's Republic of China implemented a policy directive titled Administrative Measures for the Export of Silver Products. The fine print was surgical. Only firms with annual refining capacity exceeding 80 tons per year and credit lines above $30 million are now permitted to export refined silver, which means the small and mid-tier refineries that historically supplied 60 to 70% of the world's refined silver were shut out overnight. This was not a tariff. This was not a trade negotiation. This was a weaponization of the global supply chain. You see, China controls approximately 70% of the world's silver refining capacity. The majority of that capacity is distributed across mid-sized private refineries in the Hunan, Jiangxi, and Yunnan provinces. These firms do not have 80-ton annual output. They do not have $30 million credit facilities. The policy effectively locked the vault and handed the key to 3 state-linked conglomerates. The result was immediate. By January 7th, 2026, physical silver premiums in London and New York spiked to $8 per ounce above the spot price. That is a 300% premium increase in 6 days. Plus, the COMEX registered silver inventory, the physical metal available for delivery against futures contracts, began draining at a rate not seen since the Hunt brothers attempted their corner in 1980. Between January 10th and January 16th, 33.45 million ounces were withdrawn from the COMEX vaults. That represents 26% of total registered inventory, gone in 7 days, which means the paper contracts that trade on the exchange, the contracts that banks use to suppress the silver price through leverage, no longer have a physical backstop. The buyers are demanding delivery, the vaults are emptying, and the banks are scrambling to source metal that China just locked behind an export wall. This is not a commodity squeeze. This is a physical run on Wall Street. Your brokerage account shows a silver position. Your IRA shows exposure to a silver ETF. But the actual metal backing those positions is evaporating in real time because the refining pipeline from China, the pipeline that kept the paper game alive, just closed. If this specific weaponization mechanism just clicked for you, or you want to track these forensic supply chain shifts as they develop, join the circle by hitting subscribe. We hold ourselves to a different standard here. Let's move to the deep dive. But even this 33 million ounce physical drain is a distraction from the real trap. You see, the reason the banks cannot simply short their way out of this rally, the reason JP Morgan's stock collapsed 4% in a single session, has nothing to do with China. It has everything to do with a regulatory glitch buried in Basel III that turned silver into a capital black hole the moment prices breached $90. A glitch so severe that a major US bullion bank reportedly failed a margin call in late December 2025 and required a $51 billion emergency liquidity injection from the Federal Reserve just to stay solvent. The math is about to get surgical. The reason the banks are bleeding is not visible on a price chart. It is buried in a regulatory framework called Basel 3.1, specifically Policy Statement PS1/26, published by the Bank for International Settlements in December 2023. The mechanism is called the Net Stable Funding Ratio, NSFR. You see, after the 2008 financial crisis, global regulators decided that banks needed to hold more stable, long-term capital against risky assets. The logic was simple. If a bank holds volatile positions, commodities, derivatives, unallocated metals, it must have enough stable funding to survive a liquidity shock without requiring a taxpayer bailout, which means every asset on a bank's balance sheet is assigned a required stable funding factor, the RSF factor. This is the percentage of stable, one-year maturity capital the bank must hold against that asset. Here is where the glitch lives. Under Basel 3.1, gold was reclassified as a Tier 1 asset. Tier 1 assets have a 0% risk weighting. which means if a bank holds $1 billion in physical allocated gold, it does not need to hold any additional stable capital against that position. Gold is treated like cash. Silver, however, was not reclassified. Silver remains classified as a commodity under the Basel framework, and commodities are assigned an 85% required stable funding factor, which means for every $1 billion in silver exposure on a bank's balance sheet, whether physical, unallocated, or derivative, that bank must hold $850 million in actual, stable, one-year maturity cash or capital. Not short-term repo funding, not overnight interbank loans, stable funding, capital that cannot be called away in a crisis. When silver was trading at $25 per ounce in late 2024, this capital requirement was manageable. A bank holding a 10 million ounce unallocated silver short position had a notional exposure of $250 million. The required stable funding was 85% of that, $212.5 million, expensive but survivable. Now silver is at $93 per ounce. That same 10 million ounce position now represents a notional exposure of $930 million. The required stable funding is 85% of $930 million, $790.5 million. The capital requirement just tripled, plus the position is underwater. If the bank shorted silver at $30 per ounce, they are now sitting on a $63 per ounce loss. That is a $630 million mark-to-market loss on 10 million ounces, which means the bank needs $790 million in stable capital to meet the NSFR requirement. And it is simultaneously bleeding $630 million in unrealized losses. The math is no longer sustainable. In late December 2025, rumors began circulating in the London bullion market. A major US-based bullion bank, widely speculated to be either Bank of America or Citigroup, had failed a margin call on a massive unallocated silver short position. The position was reportedly between 15 and 20 million ounces. At $90 per ounce, that is a notional exposure of $1.35 to $1.8 billion. The required stable funding under Basel 3.1 would be $1.15 to $1.53 billion. The bank did not have it. You see, most of these unallocated silver positions were established between 2020 and 2023, when silver was trading between $18 and $28 per ounce. The banks used these short positions to suppress the silver price and protect their derivative books. The capital requirements were low. The risk seemed manageable. But Basel 3.1 went into full enforcement in January 2025. And by December 2025, silver had already begun its climb toward $80. The NSFR trap was closing. The bank could not meet the capital requirement. It could not cover the margin call. And on December 28, 2025, the Federal Reserve reportedly provided a $51 billion emergency liquidity injection through the discount window. $51 billion to keep a single bullion bank solvent. This was not reported in the mainstream financial press. It was not disclosed in any official Fed statement. But the December 29th edition of the Financial Times ran a brief, vague mention of elevated discount window activity tied to commodity derivative stress. The forensic fingerprints are there. You see, the reason this matters to you is simple. Your brokerage account shows a silver position. Your ETF shows exposure to silver. But that exposure is almost certainly unallocated, which means you do not own the metal. You own a contractual claim on the metal, and that claim is backed by a bank that is now trapped in a Basel III capital vortex it cannot escape. When silver was $25, the bank could afford to hold that short position and honor your claim. At $93, the math has inverted. The bank is not solvent enough to deliver the metal, which means if enough retail investors demand physical delivery, if enough institutions pull their allocated positions out of the vaults, the entire unallocated system collapses. And the people holding paper claims are left with nothing but a legal battle against a bankrupt counterparty. This is not speculation. This is the mechanical outcome of the NSFR trap. Here is the part that makes this a glitch instead of an accident. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision knew that silver was used as a price suppression tool by the bullion banks. They knew that the unallocated market was 30 to 50 times larger than the physical supply. And they knew that classifying silver as a commodity with an 85% RSF factor, while simultaneously classifying gold as a Tier 1 asset with a 0% RSF factor, would create a capital asymmetry, a trap. The moment silver prices rose, the banks would face a choice: cover the short and take the loss, or hold the position and violate the NSFR. Both options lead to insolvency. The only way out is a Federal Reserve bailout, which is exactly what happened in December 2025. You see, the regulatory framework was not designed to prevent another 2008. It was designed to force the banks to choose which assets they wanted to protect. They chose gold, they abandoned silver, and now the price is reflecting that abandonment. If you hold silver in an unallocated account, your position is backed by a bank that cannot meet its capital requirements. If you hold a silver ETF, that ETF is backed by unallocated contracts with the same broken banks. The only silver that matters now is physical, allocated, and in your possession. Not in a vault with your name on a ledger, in your possession. Because the moment the next margin call hits, the moment the next bullion bank fails to meet its NSFR requirement, the entire paper market locks up. And the difference between owning the metal and owning the claim becomes the difference between wealth and a legal receipt for wealth that no longer exists. But even this $51 billion bailout is not the endgame. You see, the Basel III trap is not unique to 2026. It is a pattern, a mathematical rhythm that has played out 3 times in the last 500 years. Spain controlled the silver supply in the 1500s and collapsed when the supply lines fractured. Britain controlled the gold standard in the 1900s and collapsed when the debts exceeded the reserves. The United States controlled the petrodollar in the 1970s and is now collapsing as the commodity backing the actual metal evaporates from the system. The cycle does not change, only the date does. And the historical autopsy shows exactly where we are in the script. This is not the first time a global power has collapsed because of silver. It is the third, and the pattern is identical. In 1535, Spain controlled the largest silver mines in human history, Potosí, in modern-day Bolivia, Zacatecas, in Mexico. By 1560, Spanish silver flooded Europe at a rate of 300 tons per year. The influx was so large that it triggered what historians now call the Spanish price revolution. Prices across Europe quadrupled between 1530 and 1650. Spain became the wealthiest empire on earth, but the wealth was a mirage. You see, Spain did not produce goods. It produced silver, and it used that silver to import everything: food, weapons, textiles, labor. The empire ran a permanent trade deficit financed entirely by the metal coming out of the ground, which means the moment the supply lines fractured, the empire had no fallback. In 1588, the Spanish Armada was destroyed by the British Navy. The silver shipments from the Americas slowed, and by 1640, Spain was bankrupt. Not because it ran out of silver, because the silver stopped moving. The supply shock triggered a debt cascade that the empire could not survive. The parallel to 2026 is surgical. The United States does not produce silver. It imports 70% of its annual silver consumption. And the largest share of that imported silver, the refined investment-grade silver that backs ETFs and futures contracts, comes from China. On January 1st, 2026, China locked the supply. The empire is now facing the same fracture Spain faced in 1588. The silver stopped moving, and the debt-based system built on top of that silver is starting to collapse. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market collapsed. Not because of a recession, not because of a banking crisis, because the margin calls exceeded the capital. You see, throughout the 1920s, investors borrowed money to buy stocks at leverage ratios as high as 10 to 1, which means for every $1 they owned, they controlled $10 in stock positions. The system worked as long as stock prices kept rising. But on October 24th, 1929, prices began falling. The brokers issued margin calls. The investors could not cover, and the forced liquidations triggered a feedback loop that erased 89% of the market as value over the next 3 years. The mechanism in 2026 is identical. The asset is different. But the math is the same. In 1929, it was stocks. In 2026, it is the gold to silver ratio. For the last 50 years, the gold to silver ratio has averaged between 70 to 1 and 80 to 1, which means it takes 70 to 80 ounces of silver to buy 1 ounce of gold. This ratio is not natural. It is artificial. It is maintained by the suppression of silver prices through unallocated paper contracts and derivative leverage. In January through 2026, the ratio collapsed to 35 to 1. That is the lowest ratio since 1980, the year the Hunt brothers attempted to corner the silver market, which means the paper suppression mechanism has failed. The market is reverting to its historical hard asset ratio, and the banks holding short positions on silver are now facing the same type of margin call that destroyed the stock market in 1929. The leverage is unwinding. The capital does not exist to cover the positions, and the regulators cannot stop it because the Basel III framework has already locked the trap. Here's the part that changes the timeline permanently. Silver is no longer classified as an industrial byproduct. It is being reclassified as a national strategic asset. You see, in December 2025, the U.S. Department of Energy published a report titled Critical Minerals for Advanced Energy Systems. The report explicitly listed silver as a Tier 1 critical mineral, the same classification currently held by lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. The reason is technical. Silver is the most thermally conductive metal on Earth, which means it is irreplaceable in next-generation photovoltaic solar cells. The efficiency gain from using silver-based contacts versus copper-based contacts is 14%. That is not marginal. That is the difference between a solar grid that works and a solar grid that requires double the land area to generate the same power. Plus, silver is now critical to the cooling systems in nuclear-powered AI data centers. You see, the AI boom is not powered by wind turbines. It is powered by small modular reactors, SMRs. And SMRs generate heat that must be dissipated at a rate 30% faster than traditional nuclear reactors. The only metal that can handle that thermal load at scale is silver, which means the global AI infrastructure, the infrastructure that every government and every megacorporation is now racing to build, requires a minimum of 230 million ounces of silver per year just for cooling systems and photovoltaic integration. 230 million ounces. The global mine supply in 2025 was 820 million ounces, which means AI and solar alone are consuming 28% of total supply. And that does not include traditional industrial uses, electronics, medical devices, water purification, or jewelry. The structural deficit is locked in. In 2024, global silver demand was 1.1 billion ounces. The global mine supply was 820 million ounces. The deficit was 280 million ounces. That deficit was filled by recycling and above-ground stockpiles. In 2025, demand rose to 1.2 billion ounces due to the AI and solar ramp. Supply remained flat at 820 million ounces. The deficit grew to 380 million ounces. In 2026, demand is projected to reach 1.3 billion ounces. Supply is projected to drop to 750 million ounces due to the China export restrictions. The deficit is now 550 million ounces. There is not enough recycled silver to fill that gap. There are not enough above-ground stockpiles to fill that gap. Which means the only variable that can balance the equation is price. The price must rise until demand is destroyed, but demand cannot be destroyed, because the AI data centers cannot function without the cooling systems, and the solar grids cannot meet efficiency targets without the silver-based contacts, which means the price will continue rising until the financial system breaks. And the banks holding unallocated short positions will continue bleeding capital until the Federal Reserve runs out of liquidity to provide. Spain collapsed when the silver stopped moving. The United States is collapsing for the same reason. The mechanism is identical, the timeline is identical, the only difference is the scale. Spain's economy in 1588 was approximately $12 billion in modern terms. The US economy in 2026 is $28 trillion. The collapse will be proportional. Which brings us to the final question. If the deficit is structural, if the banks are trapped by Basel III, and if the supply is locked behind a Chinese export wall, what do you do with the paper receipts in your brokerage account that claim to represent silver you will never be able to touch? The answer is not speculation. It is protocol. If a bank with a $51 billion Federal Reserve lifeline cannot survive the Basel III capital trap, your retail paper account will not survive it either. The solution is not complex. It is mechanical. Physical silver, allocated, in your possession. Not in a vault with your name on a digital ledger, not in an ETF that promises delivery you will never receive, in your hand. Because the paper market is a claim on metal that does not exist in the quantity promised. And the moment the next margin call triggers, the moment the next bullion bank fails its NSFR requirement, the unallocated system locks. The receipts become worthless. And the only wealth that survives is the wealth you can touch. The glitch was not an accident. It was a deadline. Basel III was not designed to protect the banking system. It was designed to expose it, to force the banks to choose which assets they would defend and which assets they would abandon. They chose gold. They classified it as Tier 1, 0% risk. They abandoned silver. They left it classified as a commodity. 85% capital requirement, which means the regulators built the trap. The banks walked into it, and now the math is executing the collapse on a timeline that cannot be delayed. Those who hold the metal own the future. Those who hold the receipts own the glitch. The window for paper wealth closed on January 1st, 2026. The only question now is whether you recognize the deadline before it passed.